is created. Now I have a small crisp document for you to read through, which makes it much easier rather than go through the PPTs. I would prefer to use this, right? Today's session, I'll explain about the various components of an ER diagram, right? And tomorrow's session, we'll look at how to create one, and then also learn about the interfaces, how to do the data mapping. Okay, we'll take an example tomorrow and then get the final details. But today's session, we'll learn how to interpret and understand what data goes into a data model. Right? Just give me a minute. All right. Okay. So I'll take this example about a hospital management system. Right? Now, let's say you want to create a system which will broadly capture all the information about the doctors, right? And when a new patient comes in, the patient should be able to register himself, and then he can create appointments. Okay? So basically, here what you're allowing is, let me take a whiteboard. Yeah. So let me briefly explain the requirement and then see how do we translate that into a ER diagram, right? So you're preparing a hospital management system, okay? And what does this do? Whenever a new doctor comes in, the doctor has to, complete the formalities and then register into the system. So you enter all the doctor information, right? Let's call that as a doctor registration. A new doctor comes in, so you capture all this information. Then when a new patient comes in, right, so he also has to register. So you'll capture all the details regarding the patient, whatever you want to capture. And then only after the patient is registered, you can create an appointment. Okay? So create appointment. Okay. So then you can also modify or update or cancel the appointment, right? All this can happen, right? Not update and modify are the same, so let's not get this. You can create, modify or cancel an appointment. Okay. Then what? After the appointment is done, then maybe you can make a payment. Okay. So payment would also involve two components, like the payment would have a insurance component and the co-payment as well. So it has those two types of payment. Okay. Anything else? Yeah, that's pretty much is the functionality what a hospital can do, right? Now, for this kind of functionality, right, how do we go about creating a database, right? So like I said, the first step involved is to figure out what data we need to store, right? We need to do the requirement analysis, right? And if you look at the previous screens, I have told you that what are the user needs, what should go into the database. That is what we need to figure out, right? So broadly, when you are creating each screen, you will figure out, each requirement or each functionality, you figure out, what data do I need to store, right? So that you'll have to clearly call out in your business requirements. Okay. For example, when you are picking up this screen, when you are picking up this functionality of a doctor registration, you design your screen that my screen should look something like this, right? And then it would capture the name, address, details about his mobile number, his specializations, his preferred timings, a lot of other details that you want to capture, his previous experience and all that. There would be some 10-15 sets of information which the SME would tell you, right? And all that should go into your doctor registration screen, right? Now the reason why you are capturing this is because you want to store it, right? Otherwise you would have not even captured it, right? So this forms the basis for your database. So you clearly know that this is the doctor information that I need to store. Okay, so when the architect is creating the database, he'll look at this screen and then say, okay, now these are the data points that that are required to be stored in the system. So I'll better make sure that when I create this screen, I'll store this data, right? Then similarly, when you are registering a patient, there will be a screen for patient, right? And we'll capture like the payment. You would capture the patient name and his diagnosis and then his previous history. There are a lot of details that you will capture, right? So all that again has to be stored in your system, right? So as part of the requirements, you're purely coming in from a functional point of view. Each activity that the system is expected to do, the screen wise, you have to capture the details as well, right? What information that we need to store. Okay. Similarly, when you're creating an appointment, okay, there would be one screen which will tell you, these are the data points. You'll have to capture the doctor information, doctor ID, then you have to capture the patient ID, then you'll have the time, right? And all those details has to be captured. Okay, so this would lead to some additional pieces of information, right? And making the payment again would have one more screen which will show what is the payment part of bill generation and payment. All that there will be one two screens to capture all the required information. So broadly, from a requirement point of view, when you are looking, designing these screens or capturing the requirement for each screen, you have identified what data needs to be stored, right? So, the high level, at a high level, you clearly know that these are the data points that you need to store. Okay. Now, when you're looking at a database, right? So there are three main components which come in, right? You have entities, attributes, and relationships, right? Now attributes are nothing but the data points about each entity, right? So that's the reason we call it as an entity and the relationship diagrams. Okay. Now let me briefly introduce all these three things: entities, attributes, and relationships, and then we'll understand how we will be effectively able to retrieve this information. Okay. Now, entity by definition is any person, place, event, or a thing or an object about which we need to store information. Okay. So look out for these kind of things when you are drawing an ER diagrams, right? Each one of them becomes an entity, right? Person, place, object, thing, or a event, right? So these are the four things, right? Now based on your requirements, right? So based on your requirements, figure out who are all the persons in your system. So you could figure out there is a doctor, there is a patient also. Is there anybody else who is using your system or who is involved in your system? Nobody. So you don't really need to consider them as entities. Then a place, right? So do you have any places over here within the scope of the system? Might not be, right? So it's all one single hospital. So there is no place, or maybe you will have to store about your insurance details as well, right? So this, maybe this could be considered an entity, right? Then some object or a thing, like a bill. A bill is a thing, right? So it's a physical thing that you can see, right? So you're storing information about that as well. And finally, some transactions, like whenever you're creating an appointment, right? So that's a transaction or an event. Similarly, a payment is a event or a transaction which is happening, right? So we need to store information about that. So broadly, if you go by the definition, you will figure out what are all the entities, right? So there is a doctor entity, there is a patient entity, there is an appointment, payment, bill, and insurance company. So that's the first step that we do as part of ER diagram creation. Okay, you will figure out all those entities. Clear about this? So guys, in case you don't understand anything or you want to get a little more clarity, feel free to ask me, interrupt and ask questions. Okay, don't wait till the end of the sessions to ask any questions, right? So make sure that you clarify anything that you don't understand right after. Yeah. Anybody has a question? So please go ahead with your question. That's perfectly okay. Good. Yes, if you're talking, it's not audible. You make sure that you're unmuted and then talk. Okay. Anyway, let me continue. In case you have questions, feel free to interrupt and ask questions. So the first step is where you're figuring out all those entities. Right? So go by the definition, figure out what are all the people, things, transactions, and objects about which we need to store information about. Right? And once you have identified that, then figure out what data about each one of them that you need to store. Right? So you'll have to store some information about about the doctors, about the patients, about the appointments, right? Now what exactly are the details that you're storing would become your attributes. Okay. Now most of these details would come in from those screens that you've looked at. Right? So for creating a doctor, you have captured all this information. Now where do you store all this information regarding the doctor? So that goes into the doctor entity. Right? So basically all the related information related to the doctor you're storing here. All the information related to the patient you're storing here. So what the data modeler or the data the technical architect who is designing the database would do is he would look at your BRD. He would look at what data you're capturing about each of those entities that he has identified. Right? So he would look at each of those screens that you have created and then the data points. And then he would map it to the particular entity. Right? So that is how your requirement is getting translated into your entities and then the attributes into that. Okay. So is this point clear? Because your role primarily would be in figuring out what data that needs to be stored, right? How it's going to be stored, how an ER diagram is to be created, and all would be taken care of by the architects. So you don't really design a database. You only capture the information what is required at a requirement level, okay, which should be translated into the ER diagram. Okay, so the second point is you're capturing all the attributes. So you'll figure out about doctor. I have to capture his name, address, city, state, zip code, phone number, pager number, the primary specialty, right? His previous experience and his timings, whatever details that you have captured, in your registration form or later details, will ensure that that gets captured into your doctor entity. Okay. Similarly, when you're capturing a patient, you'll also capture that. So not just that, you'll also capture. You'll not only capture all these data, you'll also capture the metadata about each data point, which is what is the type of data, right? Whether it's mandatory or optional, and then whether it's the size of the data as well, and then maybe a brief description, right? So this is basically the metadata, similar to what we did for interfaces, right? So you'll figure out all the data, each data point. You'll figure out whether it's mandatory or not, what is the size it can be, what can it be, whether it's a text or is it a number or is it a date, right? All that would be covered as part of your metadata. Okay. So what you're doing is you're capturing the entities first, right? So you're deriving the entities from the requirement. Then you're also identifying the attributes for each of those entities that you need to store, right? And then the next step of ER diagram is you're basically defining the relationships between these various entities, right? Now, if you have to understand why do we need these informations, right? Let's say all these relations are not there, right? So you just captured the doctor information, patient information, and then all those are like available in your system, but there are no relationships, right? So obviously we will not be able to retrieve it much more effectively. Why? Because let's say I want all the patient information to be retrieved. So all the the payment made by this patient to be retrieved. Okay. Now, if I have not stored this relationship, I cannot link any of these payments to the patient. Right? So obviously, it becomes difficult for me to retrieve that information. So there is no point in maintaining that information if you cannot retrieve it, right? So that makes the relationships critical. So the relationships needs to be identified to ensure that the information can be effectively retrieved later. Okay, so that is the main intention of storing the data, so that you can utilize it later. So you will ensure that you're capturing that information. Okay, so those are the three main components of an ER diagram: entity, attributes, and relationships. Okay. So entities are nothing but you go by the definition, identify one of those four: persons, people, the people, then things, places, and events about which you need to store. Those becomes the entities. Then the details about each entity becomes the attributes, right? The other thing what we need to know is about a primary key about an attribute, right? So usually, see, all this data finally goes and gets stored in as a group of tables. Yeah. So at the end of it, all you're doing is you're creating a table for each of those entities. Like doctor, there would be a table, and all the attributes that you have identified for the doctor becomes the columns, right? So ID, number, first name, last name, middle name, address, city, and all. Then any new doctor which comes in would be entered as a new row. Okay, so that is how your databases would be, your ER diagrams would be translated into the actual database. So clear about this? Do you fairly get an understanding about how do we approach a database? How is this from a high level scope statement to requirement, and from requirement you identify the entities,
and from entities, how is it getting into the final structure and then get data getting stored. Any questions?
Raju, are we creating, I mean, how are we creating this database thing with some tools?
Right. There are some tools like Visio. There is a tool, right? And then there are some softwares which can do. And but ER diagrams, I think there's nothing.
I mean, like,
There's no.
you're telling us how to do this thing, but you're not showing us what tools we use and how to implement them.
Now, like I said, in an ER diagram, all you're creating is all you're responsible is to ensure that you figure out what data needs to be stored. Right? Only the requirements part. What is it that we need to store is what you are doing. Right? Now we are, like I said, you are not creating a ER diagram. Right? So you'll never create an ER diagram. So that can be sure. Okay? Because you need that specialized knowledge about databases and how to carry on the rest of the activities as well to create an ER diagram, right? So you are not expected to create an ER diagram, but what all details you capture would generally be translated into an ER model. Okay. Now, so your output, which is your the screens that you're creating and then the data that you're identifying, would be an input to your ER diagram. And the second reason why we are learning about these ER models is we should be able to look at an ER model and then understand what it means, right? So it should not be completely that we don't know what an ER model is and all, right? If I show you this, you should be able to interpret, okay, there's 6 entities in this, and each entity, about doctor entity, this is the information that I'm capturing, and a doctor and an appointment are related through, and these are the rules governing them. Right? So at a high level, you should be able to interpret it. So why do we need this? Where will we need be using this? Maybe when we are working on interfaces, right? So when you are working on interfaces, we need to link it back to where that particular data is stored. You have to look at your database and then say, what? The doctor information is in this table, so pick it up from this table and populate the interface. So the data mapping part, we would use it. The second thing is maybe during testing, right? So when you're when you're testing the application, maybe you want to understand what data is going and sitting in which table, right? So let's say you've created a new appointment, right? So the appointment should go and then be populated into the appointment table. When a new doctor is registered, it should go and then update the doctor into this table. So during testing also, maybe you want to have that high level view, which table gets populated with that data, right? So all those testing, at the time of testing also you need some basics to so you need that basic understanding of ER model, right? So you're not going to create an ER model, but a high level view of how a data model looks like is something which is expected out of you. I hope that part is clear, right? So we still are not done with this topic yet. You need to know a little more details, but first try to understand what is your role in it, right? So ER models is a big topic, right? But you're not handling everything end to end in it, right? Your part is only with the requirements. So you're figuring out what data that you need to store about each one of these entities, and that comes in purely from a functional point of view as part of your BRD. Okay, but later again when you're doing your testing or interface analysis, this would help you out, right? Understanding this would help you out where this data is coming in from, or what data we need to pick. Does that make sense? Sorry, I didn't get who was the person asking that question.
Yeah, I was asking you about the tools.
Okay. All right, sir. I hope that gave you a little more clarity.
Yeah, I got it. So we are not making any ER models, so we don't have to worry about the tools
Yeah.
or
Right.
any
So
softwares.
primarily we'll make the use cases. That is what we'll deal it in very detail. Right. Now, the way we document the requirements is primarily using use cases. ER models are are not something which we'll draw. So our analysis or our analysis of the requirement and then identifying all those details would form an input to the ER models, right? So that is the connect, right? So unless you capture all those details, it becomes difficult to create an ER model. So that you'll have to understand and make sure that you are as elaborative as possible when you are capturing the requirement, right? So when there is a, like, let's say a doctor registration process, right? What all details do we need to capture from the doctor when a doctor is created, right? So you should talk to the SME and then figure out, right? So because if you miss out any of those there, obviously the person who is designing this database, the architect, would not add in those details here into the ER model. So finally during testing, the customer would say, no, you didn't capture some the doctor's appointment timings, right? So you'll have to go back and then start right from the start. You'll update the requirement, then the architect has to update the ER model, then underlying programs have to be updated. So a lot of change. Your responsibility is to make sure that the requirement is clear and comprehensive, right? So you'll make sure that the customer is okay with whatever data that you are capturing and no data is missed out, right? So that is where you'll draw all those screens and try to get as closer as possible to the final requirement. Okay, we still haven't covered about the business rules. That's another main part where you would contribute, right? So you will help identify all these business rules, right? Now I'll come out to that in maybe the next session, because now first part, let's understand about the entities and the attributes, and then we'll look at the relationships in the next session. Okay, so entities again, as the definition goes, the architect would look out for information about whether it's a person, place, event, or a thing, right? And then fill in those, or create those entities for you. Okay. Yeah. Then what? Yeah. So your the screens that you have created and then the high level information that you have captured as part of the requirements would form a basis for identifying the entities and the attributes. Okay, so this part of it is clear. So if I give you a small requirement, would you be able to figure out how my what all details do I need to capture about on each screen, and how is it related to one another? Okay, so this topic will continue in the next session. We still have to understand the relationships, and then we would take one full example, into an example of where we have the high level requirement. From here we'll create those screens and then finally create a ER diagram for that as well, right? So we'll go through that process. I think that will give you a lot more clarity. So you'll understand what you are doing, what is the data modeler doing. You'll get that clarity in tomorrow's session, right? So this topic is still not covered. We still have to understand these relationships. Now all we have tried to understand is how do we understand the requirement, and from that identify the entities and attributes. Okay, we still have to work out on understanding the relationships and ensure that all the business rules and conditions are translated into this ER diagram, and then we'll also look at an example. All right then, so let's stop here unless you have any questions. Yeah, I think somebody was asking a question.
Yeah, I mean, I missed the initial part, so can you explain it in the next session, like just the initial point?
About the data flow diagrams or ER diagrams?
Data flow.
So data flow diagram, anyway, the recorded session would be given to you. So yeah, so look at it. If you have any questions, we'll take it up in next session. Right?
Sure.
Again, like I said, it's an outdated technique. It's not so frequently used. I at least have not used them. Right? It's that outdated technique. So these days we definitely will not use a data flow diagram. Just that since we have to cover it, I gave you a very high level overview about it. Okay.
Okay.
But ER diagrams is still important to you because now almost all your database are designed using ER diagrams. So you need to be aware of this. Right?
Okay.
So next session we'll cover about the relationships and
Sure.
then we'll take an example and then go through the complete process so that we understand it. Okay?
Okay. Yeah.
All right then. Have a nice weekend and we'll meet
You
again
too.
on Monday. Bye-bye.
Bye.